This brick office went up in 1929, the year they decided wood wasn't enough, the year after the fire stopped.
She never talked about William.
Never talked about the fires.
But when a revenue man came by, her hand went to that road.
Tennessee Rose. Little Emma Hayes burned 20 revenue offices after they killed her 11-year-old son. The most devastating campaign of arson against the Federal Revenue Service in American history, and the most relentless act of maternal vengeance the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Tennessee Rose. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Cocke County, Tennessee, known throughout the region as one of the most defiant and ungovernable corners of the state. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into violence. Hemmed in by the ancient Great Smoky Mountains, the people who lived along the French Broad River and its countless tributaries had been fighting for survival since the first settlers arrived. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation had continued that fight. There were no telephones in most of these hollows, even into the 20th century, and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most isolated and fiercely independent sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up through the Moonshine Wars that had made Cocke County infamous, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. The revenue offices that dotted the region were symbols of an authority that the mountain people had never fully accepted, buildings that represented a system imposed from outside rather than grown from within. When a revenue man rode into one of these hollows, he was not seen as a servant of the law but as an enemy of the people. You see, in these mountains, the Federal Revenue Service was not seen as a legitimate arm of government, but as an occupying force that existed to steal from people who had little to begin with. The revenue men came to collect taxes on whiskey that mountain families had been making for generations, to destroy stills that represented a family's only hope of earning cash money, to arrest men whose only crime was following traditions that predated the federal government itself. To the people of Cocke County, the Revenue Office was not a place where law was administered, but a place where theft was organized. The woman who would become known as the Tennessee Rose was born Emma Louise Crawford in 1871, in a cabin on the banks of Cosby Creek that her great-grandfather had built with his own hands. She was called Little Emma, not because she was young, but because she was small, standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighing no more than 90 pounds, even after bearing 4 children. Emma Hayes was the smallest adult woman most people in Cocke County had ever seen, a condition that had seemed like a curse in her youth, but that she had learned to transform into something else entirely. That's right. Little Emma Hayes had spent her entire life being underestimated by those who saw only her small body and assumed that small meant weak. She had learned early that such assumptions could be turned to her advantage, that people who underestimated her inevitably made mistakes that she could exploit. She had a mind that worked faster than most people could follow, a memory that forgot nothing, and a determination that had carried her through hardships that would have broken larger and seemingly stronger people. Her marriage to a man named Thomas Hayes in 1889 had been the best thing that ever happened to her. Thomas was a farmer, and sometime moonshiner, a tall and gentle man who had seen past Emma's small stature to the extraordinary person within. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and genuine love, a partnership in which each contributed according to their strengths. Thomas provided the physical labor that the farm required. Emma provided the planning and organization that made the farm profitable. Together, they had built something that both of them were proud of. The farm they worked had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations, 100 acres of bottomland along Cosby Creek that produced corn and vegetables enough to feed the family with surplus to sell. Emma had transformed the operation after her marriage, introducing methods of organization and record-keeping that Thomas had never imagined. She kept ledgers that tracked every expense and every sale, calculated the optimal times for planting and harvesting, negotiated with buyers in ways that consistently produced better prices than Thomas had ever gotten on his own. Her reputation for business acumen spread throughout the county, and neighbors began seeking her advice on matters ranging from crop selection to livestock breeding. She helped families negotiate with merchants who had been cheating them for years, showed widows how to manage finances that their husbands had always controlled, taught young women skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Emma became, in her quiet way, one of the most influential people in the community, respected for her intelligence, even as she was underestimated for her size. The cabin where the family lived reflected Emma's personality, organized and efficient, and somehow larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside. Every space served a purpose, every item had its place, every surface was clean and well maintained. Visitors remarked that the Hayes home was the most comfortable they had ever entered, that something about the way Emma had arranged things made people feel welcome and at ease. It was a skill that could not be taught, an instinct for creating order out of chaos that had served Emma well throughout her life. The children came quickly after the marriage, 4 of them in 6 years, 3 daughters and a son. The son was named William, called Billy by everyone who knew him, and he was born in 1894, the youngest of the Hayes children and the light of his mother's life. Billy had inherited his father's height and his mother's quick mind, a combination that promised great things for his future. Emma had dreams for this boy that went beyond anything she had ever dreamed for herself, visions of education and opportunity that might lift him out of the poverty that had always defined mountain life. By 1905, Billy Hayes was 11 years old and already showing signs of the exceptional person he might become. He was the best student in the small school he attended, quick with numbers and hungry for books in a way that none of his classmates could match. He helped his father on the farm with a cheerfulness that made the hardest work seem light. He looked after his older sisters with a protectiveness that belied his young age. He was, in every way that mattered, exactly the son that Emma and Thomas had hoped for. The Hayes family, like most families in Cocker County, supplemented their farming income by making whiskey. Thomas operated a small still in a hollow above their farm, producing corn whiskey that he sold to buyers who came from as far away as Knoxville seeking quality liquor. The operation was modest by the standards of the region, producing just enough to provide the cash money that the family needed to survive. It was simply part of mountain life, as natural as hunting deer or raising hogs, and the Hayes family saw nothing wrong with it. Now, to understand what happened in the summer of 1905, you need to understand the war that the federal government had been waging against mountain moonshiners for decades. That's right. The revenue men had been raiding mountain stills since the end of the Civil War, trying to collect taxes that the moonshiners refused to pay, and to enforce laws that the moonshiners refused to acknowledge. The conflict had claimed hundreds of lives on both sides, had filled federal prisons with men whose only crime was making whiskey the way their fathers and grandfathers had made it, and had created a hatred between mountain people and federal authorities that ran deeper than any political disagreement. The Federal Revenue Office that operated in Cock County in 1905 was led by a man named Revenue Agent Marcus Blackwood, a career bureaucrat who had built his reputation on the number of stills he had destroyed and the moonshiners he had arrested. Blackwood was 43 years old, a veteran of countless raids, and he approached his work with a zeal that his superiors in Nashville found admirable and that the mountain people found terrifying. He had no sympathy for the moonshiners, saw them as criminals who deserved whatever punishment the law provided, and he was willing to use whatever methods were necessary to accomplish his mission. Blackwood had assembled a team of 20 revenue agents who shared his philosophy and his methods. They were hard men, most of them recruited from outside the region, men who had no connection to the communities they policed and no understanding of the culture they were trying to suppress. They operated with little oversight from their nominal superiors, who preferred not to know the details of how Blackwood achieved his results. The revenue agents were, in effect, a law unto themselves, answerable to no one as long as they continued to make arrests and destroy stills. The Hayes family had managed to avoid serious conflict with the Revenue Service for years, operating their still carefully and selling their whiskey discreetly. Thomas understood the risks and took precautions that had kept him out of the revenue men's sights. But in the spring of 1905, someone informed on the Hayes operation providing Blackwood with detailed information about where the still was located and when it would be in operation. The informant was never identified, but the result of his betrayal would change everything. And that's when Revenue Agent Marcus Blackwood decided to make an example of the Hayes family that would terrorize the entire region into compliance. You see, the raid that Blackwood planned for the Hayes farm was designed to be more than a routine enforcement action. He had decided to use excessive force to destroy not just the still, but the family's reputation for having avoided federal attention for so long. He believed that breaking the Hayes family would send a message to everyone in Cock County about what happened to moonshiners who thought they could operate with impunity. He had no way of knowing that his raid would set in motion events that would destroy his career and burn federal revenue offices across 3 states. The raid took place on a hot July morning when Thomas Hayes was working his still and Emma was tending the garden near the cabin. 20 revenue agents descended on the property from multiple directions, moving with a military precision that gave the family no chance to escape or hide. Thomas saw them coming and ran for the woods, hoping to draw their attention away from his family. The agents pursued him, firing their weapons, driving him deeper into the forest. Billy Hayes was playing near the creek when the raid began, catching crawfish in the shallow water, as he had done countless times before. He heard the gunshots echoing through the hollow, heard his mother screaming words he could not quite make out, and he did what any brave 11-year-old boy would do. He dropped the bucket he had been carrying and ran toward the sound of trouble, wanting to help his family, not understanding the danger he was running into. The path from the creek to the cabin led through a stand of trees that Billy knew as well as he knew his own name. He had played in these trees since he could walk, had climbed every one of them, had built forts and hideouts throughout the forest. He ran through them now with the speed of familiarity, his small feet finding the best path without conscious thought, his eyes fixed on the cabin that was coming into view through the branches. He emerged from the trees just as a group of revenue agents was approaching the cabin from the east, and in the confusion of the moment, one of those agents raised his rifle and fired. The agent would later say that he had seen movement in his peripheral vision, had reacted instinctively to what he perceived as a threat, had not understood until too late that his target was a child. Whether this was true or simply a convenient explanation would never be determined. The bullet struck Billy in the chest just below his heart, killing him instantly. He fell without a sound, his small body crumpling to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The bucket of crawfish he had been carrying lay beside him, the creatures scattering across the ground in their desperate search for water. His eyes remained open, staring at the sky, seeing nothing. The agent who fired the shot was a man named Deputy Revenue Agent Samuel Whitmore, a nervous young man who had been with the service for less than a year. Whitmore would later claim that he had mistaken the boy for an armed adult, that the confusion of the raid had made it impossible to distinguish child from man. His superiors would accept this explanation, would declare the shooting a tragic accident that occurred in the line of duty. No charges would ever be filed. No discipline would ever be administered. Billy Hayes would be written off as an unfortunate casualty of the war against moonshining. Emma Hayes witnessed her son's death from 50 feet away, close enough to see the bullet strike his small body, close enough to hear the sound he made as he fell. She ran to him, gathered him in her arms, held him as the life left his body, and he became simply a thing, an object that had once been her child. The revenue agents stood around her in a circle, some of them looking uncomfortable, others simply waiting for the scene to be over so they could complete their mission. None of them offered any help. None of them expressed any sympathy. They were there to destroy a still, and they would not be distracted by the death of a child. Thomas Hayes was captured in the woods an hour later, brought back to the farm in chains to find his son dead and his wife cradling the body. The still was destroyed, the whiskey confiscated, and Thomas was arrested and transported to the federal lockup in Knoxville. He would spend the next 2 years in federal prison, sentenced for operating an illegal still, unable to be with his wife as she buried their son and mourned alone. The funeral of Billy Hayes was held 3 days later in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church in Cosby. The entire community turned out to pay their respects. Hundreds of people who understood that what had happened to the Hayes family could have happened to any of them. Emma stood at the graveside without weeping, her small body rigid with a grief that had gone beyond tears. Her daughters stood beside her, their faces wet, their bodies shaking with sobs. Thomas was absent, locked in a cell in Knoxville, denied even the mercy of attending his son's burial. That night, after the mourners had departed and the house had fallen silent, Emma Hayes sat alone in the darkness and made a vow that would define the rest of her life. She would not kill the men who had murdered her son, though God knew they deserved to die. She would not attack the agents themselves, understanding that such violence would only bring more violence upon her remaining children. She would strike at the heart of their power in a way that would hurt them without giving them excuse to hurt her family further. She would burn the revenue offices, the physical symbols of the authority that had taken her son. She would destroy the buildings where their operations were planned, where their records were kept, where their power was organized. When she was done, the Federal Revenue Service in Tennessee would know that there were consequences for killing children, and that vow, spoken over the memory of a boy who died for nothing, would be fulfilled beyond anything Emma Hayes herself could have imagined. You see, little Emma Hayes didn't act impulsively despite her overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. She understood that emotion-driven action would only get her caught before she could accomplish her purpose. Instead, she spent the months following Billy's death planning her campaign with the same methodical care she had always applied to everything she did. She studied the revenue offices of eastern Tennessee and the surrounding states, identified their locations, developed plans for how each one could be destroyed. Her mind, which had always been her greatest asset, now turned itself entirely to the problem of demonstrating that power had limits. The planning process took nearly a year, during which Emma maintained the appearance of a broken woman who had accepted her family's tragedy. She went through the motions of her daily life, tending her farm, caring for her daughters, waiting for her husband's release from prison. No one suspected that behind the facade of grief, a mind was working ceaselessly on problems of logistics and timing and execution. Emma had always been underestimated because of her size. Now that tendency to overlook her would serve her purposes perfectly. The intelligence she gathered was comprehensive and detailed. She learned the locations of every revenue office within 200 miles, studied their construction, identified their vulnerabilities. She learned the schedules of the agents who staffed them, the times when the buildings were empty and the times when they were occupied. She studied the security measures that protected them, the locks on their doors, the watchmen who guarded them at night. By the time she was ready to act, she knew more about these revenue offices than the men who worked in them every day. Her small size, which had been a limitation her entire life, became an asset in this planning phase. She could approach buildings without being noticed, could move through towns without attracting attention. She was a small woman, a grieving mother, invisible in a way that no man could ever be. People's eyes simply passed over her, registering nothing threatening, nothing suspicious. She used this invisibility to gather intelligence that would have been impossible for anyone else to collect. The list of targets that Emma compiled eventually numbered 20 revenue offices across 3 states. Some had been directly involved in the raid that killed Billy, housing the agents who had participated, or processing the paperwork that had authorized the operation. Others served the administrative network that enabled Blackwood and his methods. Still others were selected for their symbolic significance, buildings that represented the federal presence in communities that had suffered under revenue enforcement. Each target was chosen with care, each attack planned with attention to detail that left nothing to chance. The first fire was set on the first anniversary of Billy's death, a date that Emma had marked from the beginning as the start of her campaign. The target was the Cook County Revenue Office itself, the building from which the raid on her farm had been organized. It was the most symbolic target on her list, and also one of the most challenging, located in the center of Newport, where any unusual activity might be noticed. Emma had spent months preparing for this moment, studying the building from every angle. Most of the other agents who had participated in the raid that killed her son. She had seen the federal government's war against moonshiners eventually wind down, had watched the passage of Prohibition and its repeal, had lived long enough to see whiskey become legal and the revenue agents become obsolete. The years following her campaign were remarkably peaceful for Emma Hayes. The authorities who might have investigated her chose not to pursue leads that pointed in her direction, perhaps understanding that arresting a grieving mother would create more problems than it would solve. The Revenue Service had been reformed, its most brutal agents removed, its methods constrained by new policies that had emerged partly in response to the fires. There was little appetite for reopening old wounds. Emma returned to the life she had known before Billy's death, though that life could never be the same. She continued to manage the farm, continued to help neighbors with their business affairs, continued to play her role in the community. But something had changed in her, some hardness that had not been there before, some distance from the ordinary concerns that occupied other people. Those who knew her well could see it in her eyes, could feel it in the way she held herself, could sense the cold fury that had never entirely faded. Her relationship with her surviving daughters remained close, though it was shaped by the secret they shared. Martha, who had helped with the final fires, understood her mother better than anyone else in the world. The other daughters suspected, but never asked, understanding that some questions were better left unasked. They gathered for holidays and birthdays, maintained the appearance of a normal family, and never spoke of the campaign that had made their mother legendary. The evening visits to Billy's grave continued throughout Emma's remaining years. Every day, as the sun began to set, she would walk up the hillside to the small cemetery behind the church and stand at her son's grave for an hour or more. Neighbors who passed the cemetery would see her small figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, her lips moving in words they could not hear. Some thought it strange that her grief remained so fresh after so many years. Others understood that some losses never heal, that some wounds remain open forever. She never expressed regret for what she had done, never apologized for the destruction she had caused, never acknowledged to anyone outside her family that she had been responsible. When asked about the Revenue Office burnings, she would simply shake her head and say that it was a terrible time, that the Revenue Service had made many enemies in those days, that she was glad the fires had stopped. Her face would reveal nothing, her voice would remain steady, and the questioner would go away none the wiser. Thomas Hayes died in 1925, having kept his wife's secret for nearly 20 years. He had never asked for details, had never wanted to know more than he absolutely had to know. He had simply loved his wife and trusted her judgment, understanding that what she was doing was a form of justice that the official system could not provide. He was buried beside Billy in the cemetery behind the Baptist church in Cosby, his headstone bearing no mention of the extraordinary events that had shaped his family's life. The grave of Billy Hayes became something of a pilgrimage site in the years following Emma's campaign, visited by people who wanted to pay their respects to the boy whose death had sparked such extraordinary events. Visitors came from throughout the region, some of them strangers who had simply heard the story and wanted to see the place where it began. They left flowers and small tokens on the grave, expressions of sympathy for a child they had never known, and admiration for the mother who had avenged him. The stone that marked his resting place bore only his name and dates, but everyone who visited knew the larger story. Billy had been 11 years old when he died, shot by a revenue agent who faced no accountability, murdered by a system that valued tax collection over children's lives. His mother had answered that murder with a campaign that changed everything. Emma's own grave lies beside her son's, on the hillside above Cosby Creek, where generations of her family rest eternally together. Her headstone bears no mention of the deeds that made her legendary, identifies her only as a beloved wife and mother, who endured more than any person should be asked to endure. But those who know the story make a point of visiting both graves, the son and the mother who avenged him, understanding that their fates were intertwined in ways that death could not sever. The story of the Tennessee Rose passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires, and passed down through generations. Songs were written about her, ballads that celebrated her determination and mourned the death of her son. Some portrayed her as a hero who had struck a blow against a corrupt system. Others painted her as a dangerous criminal who had taken the law into her own hands. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Emma Hayes story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Billy's death and ending with the final fire. These songs named names, described specific fires, celebrated Emma's determination in ways that made them almost instructional for anyone contemplating similar actions. Others focused on particular moments, dramatizing the first fire or Emma's ability to continue her campaign while under surveillance. One popular ballad described the moment when Emma set fire to the Cook County Revenue Office, painting a vivid picture of the small woman moving through the darkness with deadly purpose. The song captured her grief and her determination, her patience and her skill, creating an image that became iconic in the folk memory of the region. Singers added verses of their own over the years, expanding the narrative and embellishing the details. Another song focused on the relationship between Emma and Billy, describing the bond between mother and son in terms that brought audiences to tears. The song imagined Emma's visits to Billy's grave, put words to the conversations she had with her dead child, explored the grief that had transformed her from a peaceful farm wife into a warrior. It was more sentimental than the tactical ballads, appealing to audiences who connected with the emotional core of the story. A third song told the story from the perspective of the investigators, describing their frustration as each new fire demonstrated their failure. This song was more sympathetic to the authorities than most, acknowledging that they were simply doing their jobs, but it ultimately sided with Emma, recognizing that the system she fought had been corrupt and brutal. The most famous of these songs, known as the Tennessee Rose's Revenge, was composed in 1910 by a musician who had known the Hayes family and who had attended Billy's funeral. The song was over 20 verses long, telling the complete story from beginning to end, with a detail that suggested the composer had access to information that was not publicly known. His song has been sung in these mountains for over a century, passed from generation to generation, preserved in recordings and in the memories of singers who learned it from their parents and grandparents. Other songs took different perspectives on the events. One ballad told the story from the viewpoint of an investigator, trying to catch the arsonist, describing his frustration as each new fire demonstrated his failure. Another focused on Martha, the daughter who had helped her mother continue the campaign, when surveillance made it too dangerous for Emma to act alone. A third imagined Billy himself, looking down from heaven, watching his mother deliver the vengeance he could not have delivered himself. Historians who have studied the Emma Hayes case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to federal authority, part of a long tradition of mountain people refusing to accept the legitimacy of laws imposed from outside. Others have focused on the personal dimensions of the story, seeing in Emma's campaign a mother's grief transformed into something that transcended individual loss. Still others have examined the failures of federal enforcement, arguing that Emma's campaign was a predictable response to policies that endangered innocent people. You see, what Emma Hayes did cannot be justified by any conventional legal framework. She destroyed government property on a massive scale, caused millions of dollars in damage, and disrupted federal operations across 3 states. The fact that she targeted buildings rather than people does not eliminate the seriousness of her crimes or the potential for harm that her actions created. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn arson, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that arson is wrong. She was a mother whose 11-year-old son had been shot dead by a federal agent who faced no accountability through official channels. The system that should have punished Whitmore had instead protected him, had declared the shooting an accident, had made clear that the life of Billy Hayes had no value in the eyes of the law. What options did Emma have? What would any mother do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate recourse? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The shooting of Billy Hayes was ruled acceptable, processed through proper procedures by authorized officials, but it was not just. It was murder, plain and simple, committed by a man who had no business firing his weapon at an 11-year-old child. Emma Hayes created accountability where none existed. demonstrated that power had limits and forced changes that benefited everyone who lived under federal revenue enforcement. The specific circumstances that produced the Emma Hayes story have changed in the decades since those fires burned. The Federal Revenue Service that once terrorized mountain communities has been transformed, its methods constrained by laws and oversight that did not exist in 1905. The practice of conducting raids that endanger children has been outlawed, at least officially, by policies designed to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that befell the Hayes family. The possibility of a child being shot during a raid and the shooter facing no consequences seems unthinkable today. But it was not unthinkable in 1905, and the story of Billy Hayes stands as a reminder of what can happen when law enforcement operates without adequate oversight. But the underlying questions that Emma's story raises have not disappeared entirely. Law enforcement agencies still sometimes use excessive force. Children still sometimes become casualties of operations that should never have endangered them. The gap between what the law promises and what it delivers remains wide enough to generate rage and despair in those who find themselves on the wrong side of that gap. The story of the Tennessee Rose serves as a reminder of what can happen when that gap becomes unbridgeable. When mothers lose faith in institutions that are supposed to protect their children. The descendants of Emma Hayes still live in those Tennessee hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. Some have become law enforcement officers themselves, trying to reform the system from within, determined to ensure that what happened to Billy never happens to another child. Others have become lawyers and advocates, working through legitimate channels to achieve the accountability that their ancestors sought through fire. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred over a century ago, a campaign that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. Family reunions are held annually in the hollow where Emma raised her children, gatherings that bring together descendants from across Tennessee and beyond. At these reunions, the story of Emma and Billy is told to children who might otherwise forget, the details preserved through oral tradition as they have been for over a century. The older members of the family can name every revenue office that Emma burned, can describe the methods she used, can recount the investigation and her successful evasion of capture. The story has become sacred text, a founding myth that defines what it means to be a Hayes. Some family members have researched the history professionally, compiling documentation and interviewing elderly relatives before their memories were lost. A family historian published a privately printed book in the 1980s that collected everything known about Emma's campaign, including information that had been passed down through generations but never before committed to writing. The book circulates within the family and among historians who study Appalachian resistance traditions, preserving details that might otherwise have been forgotten. The site where the original Cock County Revenue Office once stood is marked today by a modern government building that serves different functions but occupies the same ground. Few people who pass through Newport today know the story of what happened on that site, of the boy who was shot and the mother who answered that injustice with fire. But the story is not forgotten in these mountains, passed down through families and preserved in songs that are still sung at gatherings and festivals. The mountains of Cock County remain today, much as they were in 1905, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear through hollows that have sheltered families for generations. The trees still change color each autumn, painting the mountainsides with shades of gold and red that take the breath away. The hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land since the first settlers arrived, families who remember the old stories and pass them down to their children. The revenue wars that once tore these communities apart have faded into history, remembered now mainly through stories and songs. The federal government eventually won the war against moonshining, not through force, but through time, as younger generations found other ways to earn a living, and the old skills were gradually forgotten. But the memory of the Tennessee Rose has not faded, has, if anything, grown stronger with the passage of time. Her story resonates with people who feel that the powerful do not always act justly, that ordinary people sometimes must find extraordinary ways to seek accountability. Those who live in these hills still tell stories about the Tennessee Rose, about the campaign that humbled the revenue men. about what happens when federal agents harm children and mothers decide to respond. The stories are told at family gatherings and community events, passed from elders to children, preserved in the collective memory of a people who have always valued their independence and their right to respond to injustice in their own way. The story of the Tennessee Rose endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of maternal love and what that love becomes when it is violated by unspeakable cruelty. It is the story of finding strength in what others see as weakness, of turning limitations into advantages. It is the story of power and its illusions, of systems that seem unbreakable until someone finds the courage to break them. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Tennessee Rose stood, to see the hollow where she lived and the hillside where she and Billy rest together? Would you walk the paths she walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow where the Hayes homestead stood is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it. That standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The mountains keep their secrets well, holding the memory of the Tennessee Rose close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient and eternal peaks. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Cock County in those terrible and tragic years, as long as mothers love their children with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find their own ways to respond. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow she loved and defended, but what she did and what was done to her family echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Emma Hayes, the Tennessee Rose, who burned 20 revenue offices after federal agents shot and killed her 11-year-old son Billy during a raid on the family farm in the summer of 1905. A story of love and loss, of fire and fury, of justice found where the law could not provide it. The mountains remember her sacrifice and her determination, and through them, so do we all.